Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Talking All Things Cardiopulm. I am your host, Dr. Rachel Barisi. So today is August 1st. I am recording on a Thursday. I have not been in sync with my normal schedule, but here we are. It's August 1st. And I, again, feel like a broken record because where did July go? It's just this constant speediness of time that is a little bit crazy. So we are halfway through the year, and if you're anything like me, you might be reassessing your yearly goals. And I've been doing a lot of self-reflection in the last few weeks related to my, employment and business and podcasting and all of the things. And reflecting back to my word of the year, where am I at? And just doing a little bit of that. This year has moved fast, and I honestly don't know if I am where I expected to be or where I wanted to be. Either way, here I am, right? I think that's all you can do is just reassess, reflect, and make a game plan. I am definitely someone who I'm a list person. I am a structure person. And I have a lot less structure in my day to day than I used to, right? When I worked a regular 9 to 5. And even in my flexibility, I have tried to create structure because I just do better with structure. But there are times where I kind of sit back and think, am I doing enough? Am I hitting my goals? And sometimes I feel like I was even more productive when I was working 3 jobs versus, 2. So I have to sit with that a little bit. And one of the things that I have been reflecting on is something called Parkinson's Law. Basically, a task takes as long as you allow it to. And kind of the feeling of busyness. And so I don't have to create busyness because I feel like I have things to keep me busy between podcasting and, launching a course and things like that, as well as working at the hospital. There is something about societal norms that make it feel like you have to be busy. And all of a sudden you are working more than a 9 to 5 again. And so I think, having a little bit of reflection on focus and, what things am I going after? It's actually where Get After It came from. Literally to do a task, complete a task, move on, because I can get stuck in the weeds. I can keep looking up, minutia, or procrastinate a bit. So I've been kind of sitting with a little bit of that and trying to be a little bit more focused in my approach. And I've also always kind of proud. How do you say that? I pride myself on not really consuming a lot of social media. And although I am on social media, and as I've been for the last 3 years now, prior to that, I honestly had minimal social presence for a number of reasons, mostly personal. But even when I was starting with social media and posting on all things Cardiopulm, I really didn't consume a lot. And I think that's where I was being more productive. And I have slowly crept into the doom scroll. And I know most people know what this is. All of a sudden you're scrolling and you're thinking, what the hell just happened to my time? And so I think really where that piece started from was even just kind of finding the trends that were on Instagram, or, what sound bites are being used in popularity right now. And all of a sudden that started to creep into entertainment, right? And, sending reels to friends and Nikki, right? I think we send more reels to each other in the day than anything. But reflecting on that and being in it, all of a sudden you can look up and say, where did an hour go? And that becomes a little bit scary. And so I've been trying to really focus my attention when I am on social media. It is for posting and also reintegrating consistency with exercise, which unfortunately is something that can get kicked to the wayside and lose consistency when are dabbling in multiple different things. So, um, that's been good. I've been able to increase consistency, putting it on the schedule, focus time again in the gym, and starting to hit goals again. But we're more than halfway through this year. So I do recommend that if you have set goals for yourself for the year, if you do that, if you set intentions, if you have a word, um, to come back to it and see how you're doing. And at the end of the day, if you haven't been hitting it, it's okay. But make a decision if you're going to keep that word or if it has maybe morphed and evolved into something else. That's something that I am definitely doing. But today has been awesome. I've been super productive and I want to say efficient and effective. A lot less wasting time, and have done things for myself too throughout the day, including getting my workout in this morning. So I feel really good about that, especially because I have 5 days in the hospital coming up consecutively, and that might be my longest stretch in a long time. So send good juju my way. All right. So, what I wanted to talk about today was the respiratory metaboreflex. And I mentioned it a couple of episodes ago when I was talking about inspiratory muscle training. And I wanted to dive a little bit more into the physiology. And in true me fashion, I have gotten stuck in a little bit of the weeds, but also it has been difficult to just get a blanket statement of the physiology. So when I came across the respiratory metaboreflex concept a few years back, it was actually when I was doing research on heart failure in relation to respiratory muscle training. And so there is a lot of known weakness, diaphragmatic weakness in the heart failure population. I think the percent is greater than 50% of patients with heart failure have diaphragmatic weakness. You can imagine that that percent is probably as high in other populations like COPD. So that was really where I was introduced to this concept. With heart failure, with COPD, you have patients who have this increased respiratory rate at base compared to a normal, healthy adult. And so, to kind of just blanket statement a few things, um, the diaphragm is not an easily fatigued muscle for good reason. Has a high number of type 1 fibers. It is meant to sustain long duration of activity. It is the primary muscle of breathing. Its job is to help you to initiate your normal breathing pattern, whether you're at rest or with exercise. And I do have to say, just in the world of physiology, I think there's a lot less known about the physiology of breathing with exercise compared to maybe like cardiovascular response. But with that being said, it would take a lot to fatigue the diaphragm to essentially create this respiratory metaboreflex. So there are a few studies that basically allude, and Dr. Harms is actually one article that I came across, and I actually met Dr. Harms a few years ago when we presented together at a conference. So I might have to try to get Dr. Harms involved and maybe talk about this a little bit more from a physiologic perspective and break it down a little deeper. But essentially, it takes about greater than 80% of maximal oxygen consumption to actually fatigue the diaphragm. And when they're doing these studies, they're doing things like loading breathing with resistance versus unloading breathing versus creating stimulation via the phrenic nerve. So they're really maximizing the potential of this versus just having someone exercise at high intensity. So it takes a good amount of effort to fatigue the diaphragm. when that occurs, when the diaphragm truly becomes fatigued, it creates this reflex that basically says, hey, I'm more important here. So we know that in the world of sympathetic response, for instance, to exercise, we're going to increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, increase cardiac output, and vasodilate to working muscles, while in fact we vasoconstrict to non-working muscles or non-working systems. In this situation, that sympathetic response amps back up and we get more vasoconstriction, but now we're going to get it at skeletal muscle because your gastrocs are less important than my diaphragm. So essentially, the respiratory metaboreflex is this reflex that occurs when we have an increase in ventilation to the point of diaphragmatic fatigue, and we have this increased metabolite accumulation that basically says, hey, we need to vasoconstrict in the periphery so that we can continue to supply the diaphragm. And in short, that's what's happening with the respiratory metaboreflex. You have this automatic response to protect a more important muscle. Now, there is a lot of question as to why we don't give vasoconstriction to the diaphragm muscle. My hypothesis would be because it's more important and it's a muscle that helps to maintain life, right? So in my opinion, or in a hypothesis type setting, I would say if we do have less vasoconstriction at the diaphragm, it is to prevent having diaphragmatic fatigue, which would then lead to hypoventilation and potential inability to oxygenate or ventilate appropriately. That is not fact, that is hypothesis. And that is one of the questions that's being asked in these articles because it is not fully understood. To take a different point of view of this, going back to our population with heart failure and COPD, they are working at a higher ventilatory rate at rest, at base, and they tend to fatigue very quickly. Same process is happening, right? We have changes at the skeletal muscle as well from fatigue and lack of activity, but we also have this hyperventilatory response. And with that comes the potential of this respiratory metaboreflex that basically says, hey, my respiratory response is increasing. I am potentially, yielding at concern for diaphragmatic fatigue. We have to vasoconstrict elsewhere because this is more important. So one of the hypotheses about fatigue in the heart failure population actually comes back to the respiratory metaboreflex, which then pulls in another big piece, which is, can respiratory muscle training impact this reflex? And from my understanding, the answer is yes. When people improve diaphragmatic strength, we have less of an increase in our respiratory rate with the same amount of activity. We have improved overall respiratory strength, and likely we'll have less vasoconstriction at the periphery for a longer period of time. So much benefit can come into RMT in this, facet of reflex. I want to throw one more piece in because I thought it was really interesting. Thinking about the respiratory metaboreflex, if we're increasing hyperventilation, if we're decreasing oxygenation, that is going to result in this peripheral vasoconstriction to essentially maintain appropriate blood flow to the diaphragm and respiratory musculature. In one of the articles, I believe it was the article that Dr. Harms completed, they unloaded the respiratory system. And in doing so, they had a less exaggerated response and a prolonged effect to reach fatigue, meaning that when they unloaded the respiratory system, they actually had increased blood flow to the periphery. So there is a ton of importance in understanding the effect of breathing in overall exercise capacity, as well as regular everyday life for patients who have high level of comorbidities, because you're going to have that fatigue creep. It's going to increase over time. The less you do, the less you do. And you end up with metabolic changes at the muscle itself, as well as capacity, aerobic capacity, which then leads to this potential change in ability with your ventilation to that activity. And the more you are hyperventilating with activity, the less you're going to supply that musculature and basically fatigue and quit again. So there is this process that's happening that is limiting your patient. The big picture of this whole thing is starting to incorporate breathing exercises into your patient population, into your client population, even if they are athletes, because it's going to offset some of this reflex response. And I think that can just be such a huge impact for both ends of the spectrum. So more to come on that. Big picture, respiratory metaboreflex is essentially a response, a reflex from the body when we have increased metabolite accumulation, when we have increased respiratory rate, potentially decreased oxygenation. Your body is going to have this increased sympathetic response, which results in vasoconstriction to the periphery to allow continuous blood flow to the most important musculature in the respiratory system, which will lead to overall fatigue and quitting the activity. So that was the quick and dirty. I hope that was helpful for you. I hope you learned something new from this. If you've never heard about the respiratory metaboreflex, look it up, dive in. I hope I've added something into your knowledge set for the day. If you found value from this, please drop me some stars, write a great review. If you want help with mentoring in your overall clinic setting, or if you're still in school and you need some help digesting some of this information, my link is below. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and whatever you have to do, get after it.